Okay, so to start our next session, I'll just introduce all our speakers again. This time we have 3 speakers. And I'll go ahead and introduce our additional panelist, who is not represented on this slide just yet. So to start off with, we'll have Stella Chan, Dr. Stella Chan, who will be speaking about best practices for generic drug labeling. Dr. Chan will be followed, Dr. Chan is a pharmacist from the Division of Labeling Review within the Office of Generic Drugs. Then she will be followed by Dr. Nuri Tawab. And Dr. Tawab is with the stakeholder engagement team in the Division of Prevention, Communication, and Public Engagement at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. He is speaking here today in his capacity of his previous role at the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality as a regulatory business process manager. So nothing about SAMHSA, right, Nuri? Okay, and then that's going to be followed by Dr. Susan Fan, who is a pharmacist with the Division of Legal and Regulatory Support within the Office of Generic Drug Policy. And joining us for the panel would be Dr. Heather Strandberg, who is a pharmacist also of the Division of Legal and Regulatory Support. So let's welcome our first speaker, Dr. Chan. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda, and good morning, everyone. So as Brenda mentioned, my name is Stella Chan, and I am in the Division of Labeling Review. Today, I have the pleasure of going over some of the best practices for generic drug labeling. So my presentation will be divided into 3 parts to cover my learning objectives. First, I will go over best practices to update ANDA labeling following revision of the approved labeling of a reference listed drug, or the RLD. Then I will review best practices for addressing patents and exclusivities as it relates to generic drug labeling. And last, I will provide updates on current best practices on distributing electronic labeling. So let's jump right into an overview on updating ANDA labeling following revision of the RLD labeling. First, some background. Generic drugs are required to have the same labeling as the RLD, except for differences allowed per the regulations, such as those differences approved under a suitability petition, differences due to different manufacturers, omission of information protected by patent or exclusivity, or revisions made to comply with FDA labeling guidelines or other guidance. Applicants are expected to update labeling at the earliest time possible after the FDA has approved labeling for the corresponding RLD. Labeling for discontinued and non-marketed ANDAs that are not withdrawn must also update their labeling to be the same as the most recently approved RLD labeling. If the RLD has been withdrawn for reasons other than safety or effectiveness, the labeling for the pending and marketed ANDA products may still need to be updated to reflect changes that would have been necessary had the NDA not been withdrawn. The guidance titled Updating ANDA Labeling After the Marketing Application for the Reference Listed Drug Has Been Withdrawn describes this process. In January 2006, the FDA published a final rule known as the Physician Labeling Rule, or PLR, which amended the requirements for the content and formatting of drug labeling. This final rule is being implemented in stages, and therefore, it is important to note that generic drugs must update their labeling to be in PLR format when the RLD labeling is updated to be in the approved PLR format. PLR format labeling communicates accurate and up-to-date information on the safe and effective use of drugs, reduces the number of adverse reactions resulting from medication errors due to misunderstood or incorrectly applied drug information, and it makes the prescribing information more accessible for use with electronic prescribing tools and other electronic information resources. Now, since it is the applicant's responsibility to monitor for RLD labeling changes, you all might be wondering where to find this information. Applicants should routinely monitor drugs at FDA, which lists recently approved RLD labeling. Applicants may also choose to subscribe to CDER's listserv, which provides email updates on new approvals and announcements related to labeling. This slide will go over how to submit ANDA labeling changes made to be in accordance with the RLD labeling. For unapproved ANDAs, applicants should submit labeling changes in an amendment following the recommendations outlined in the guidance titled ANDA Submissions Amendments to Abbreviated New Drug Applications under GDUFA. For tentatively approved ANDAs, applicants should submit labeling changes in an amendment to the tentatively approved application. For recommendations on the timing of the amendment to enable final approval, refers to the guidance titled ANDA Submissions, Amendments, and Requests for Final Approval to Tentatively Approved ANDAs. For approved ANDAs, applicants should submit labeling changes to conform to RLD labeling as a CBE supplement. Additional recommendations can be found in the FDA guidance titled Changes to an Approved NDA or ANDA. And that brings us to my first challenge question. Which of the following resources should be used to find the last approved labeling for the RLD? Is it A, DailyMed, B, the Orange Book, C, Drugs at FDA, or D, the USP National Formulary? I'll give some time for everyone to think about this one. And for those here in the room with me, please raise your hand if you think that the answer is A, DailyMed, B, the Orange Book, C, Drugs at FDA, or D, USP National Formulary. So for those who answered C, that is the correct answer. Drugs at FDA lists approved labeling, approval letters, and other information for drug products, which should be used to find the most recently approved RLD labeling. Next, I will go over best practices for addressing patents and exclusivities. But before I do so, I'd like to add a disclaimer that this section will only go over addressing patents and exclusivities as it relates to generic drug labeling. First, a quick overview of patent certifications. If there are no patents listed in the Orange Book, or if the patents have expired, the applicant must submit one of the following: a paragraph 1 certification that the patent information has not been filed, a paragraph 2 certification that the patent has expired, or a statement that there are no relevant patents. For each unexpired patent listed in the Orange Book, the applicant must provide the patent number and submit one of the following: a paragraph 3 certification that the applicant will not enter the market until the listed patent expires, a paragraph 4 certification that the patent is invalid, unenforceable, or will not be infringed by the manufacturer, use, or sale of the drug product for which the application is submitted for, or a Section 8 statement that the method of use patent does not claim a proposed indication or other condition of use. Applicants must address any new timely filed patent use codes when added to an existing patent with either a new paragraph 3 or a paragraph 4 certification or a new Section 8 statement. And this bullet point is important. Reference to a previously submitted certification is not sufficient. When it comes to addressing exclusivities for approved ANDAs, new labeling carve-outs due to exclusivities should be submitted as a prior approval supplement. Labeling carve-outs to align with an agency-issued BPCA template should be submitted as a CVE supplement. And applicants should remember that in addition to submitting revised labeling for any carve-outs, the submission should also include a statement addressing the new exclusivity or exclusivities to clearly state their intent. Listed on this slide are some of the recommendations when addressing patents and exclusivities to potentially reduce review cycles. Include a screenshot of the Orange Book listing patents and exclusivities for the RLD. Submit a patent and exclusivity table under Module 1.3.5 listing how each patent and exclusivity is addressed. Certifications or statements should include references to patent use codes if applicable. And ensure that all patent certifications and exclusivity statements are congruent amongst themselves and with the proposed labeling. For example, if a Section 8 statement is submitted for a patent use code or an exclusivity claims that the protected information will be carved out, then the labeling submitted should not include the protected information. And that brings us to my second challenge question. Is the following patent certification acceptable? Firm previously submitted a paragraph 4 certification with respect to patent 1234567. The firm hereby states that we intend to extend its paragraph 4 certification to the newly listed patent use code U1234. Give some time for you all to think this one through. And for those here in the room with me, if you think that yes, the patent certification is acceptable, please raise your hand. Seeing none, those in favor of no. Yep, for those who answered no, you are correct. Reference to a previously listed patent certification is not sufficient. A new patent certification needs to be submitted for any new timely filed patent use codes when added to an existing patent. So moving on to my discussion on electronic labeling. Medication guides may be distributed to authorized dispensers through a website. The website should be non-promotional, and it should display a PDF of the medication guide. Please note that applicants providing the means to produce medication guides through a website, as described above, remains responsible for fulfilling the obligations per the regulation to produce the medication guide in sufficient numbers. Labeling revisions to allow for electronic medication guides may be submitted as a CBE supplement, provided that that is the only change being made to the labeling components. If other changes are needed to the labeling, then those changes will need to be submitted under the appropriate reporting category. A statement should be added to the immediate container label and carton labeling for the dispenser to identify the website for the electronic medication guide, such as a statement, dispense with medication guide available at, and then the URL, or dispense the medication guide provided separately to each patient on the principal display panel with the URL found on the side panel. Remember to ensure that the link or QR code is correctly listed and operational. And this last bullet point is an update to our previous thinking. A statement to print the medication guide should not be included in the prescribing information or in the medication guide itself, since such a statement is intended for the dispenser and not intended for the prescriber or the patient. For prescribing information, it is acceptable to provide the PI in an electronic format in addition to providing a printed copy. It is not acceptable to discontinue printing the PI and substitute a website URL in its place. As per the regulation listed, prescription drug labeling should contain the prescribing information required and in the format specified. Similar to the previous slide, it is acceptable to provide patient labeling, such as the patient information leaflet, in an electronic format in addition to providing a printed copy. It is not acceptable to discontinue printing the patient labeling with substituting a URL in its place. As per the regulation listed here, patient labeling must be printed immediately following the PI or otherwise accompany the drug product. And that brings us to my final challenge question. The proposal to distribute an electronic medication guide via the addition of a URL to the container and carton labeling with no other changes may be submitted as A, an annual report, B, a CVE supplement, or C, a prior approval supplement. For those who think that the answer is A, an annual report, please raise your hand. How about B, a CVE supplement? C, prior approval supplement? So for those who answered B, a CVE supplement, you are correct. Labeling revisions to allow for electronic medication guides may be submitted as a CVE supplement if that is the only change being made to the labeling components. Listed here are some of the guidances and other resources that I used or mentioned throughout this presentation. And in summary, generic drug labeling should be updated at the earliest time possible after the FDA has approved labeling for the corresponding RLD. All newly listed, timely filed patent use codes must be addressed when added to an existing patent. And it is acceptable to distribute electronic medication guides to a dispenser via a URL or QR code in lieu of printing physical copies. In closing, adherence to ANDA labeling best practices facilitates the labeling review process and enables the fulfillment of GDUFA-3 labeling commitments, resulting in the approval of safe and effective generic drugs for the American public. Thank you everyone so much for your attention. I'll be happy to take any questions during the Q&A panel. Thank you. And next I'd like to introduce Dr. Nuri Tawwab.